This is the story of the Odyssey and perhaps some of the history that may lie behind the Odyssey. It is Homer's great epic, telling the story of how Odysseus, one of the heroes at the Trojan War, tries to get back home, but finds his voyage blocked by drug takers, one-eyed giants, witches, ghosts, all kinds of adventures. And we look at how he makes one fatal mistake, which ends up destroying everybody on his voyage except for himself. This episode is brought to you by the Lloyds 5K house deposit, and this is something that was last seen in 1996.
Yeah, so the 1990s looks now like a lost golden age of prosperity and positivity, doesn't it? Think of the advent of the Blair administration in 1997, all the enthusiasm and excitement that surrounded that, the economic growth of the time, the technological developments, the sort of sense of an endless golden summer where everybody's listening to Blair and Oasis and looking forward to buying their first houses. And that, of course, takes us to mortgages. Now, the good news is that in a nod to the 1990s, Lloyds are offering 5K deposit mortgages to first-time buyers. So search 5K first-time buyer.
1996 average first-time buyer deposits are based on ONS data. Subject to status, your home may be repossessed if you don't keep up repayments, and conditions apply.
Let's begin right at the beginning. And for people who don't know the Odyssey, we pick up in the final moments of the Trojan War. So Troy, the great city, the greatest city in Asia, supposedly, on the banks of the Hellespont or the Dardanelles. So if people remember the Dardanelles from our Gallipoli episode, Troy has been reduced to a smoking ruin. And the people that have done this, Tom, are the Greeks. But Homer doesn't call them the Greeks, does he?
No, he calls them the Achaeans. So I think throughout this these two episodes, we will be calling the Greeks the Achaeans. That is the word that Homer uses. And the Achaeans and the Trojans have been fighting on the plain of Troy. And the Achaeans are there to seize back the kidnapped Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world, who has been stolen by Paris, the Prince of Troy. And the Trojans are fighting to keep her. And they've been doing this, as we say, for 10 years. And it looks an absolute deadlock. But then, and I'm going to quote here a bard who features in the Odyssey, and he describes how the sons of Achaea laid the city waste after pouring out of the horse. And the horse, of course, is the Trojan horse, the most successful wheeze in the whole of mythology, I would guess, in the whole history of warfare, certainly the most famous. So famous that it inspired a disastrous project in the Gallipoli invasions, didn't it? They got some ship and ran it on, and it was an absolute disaster.
Yeah, ran it up onto the beach and then everyone shot them.
However, the original Trojan horse is not a disaster. It's an absolutely crunching success. And the person who thinks it up is the man who gives his name to the Odyssey. And this is a guy called Odysseus, and he is the son of Laertes. And he's the king of a very small, poor island off the west coast of Greece called Ithaca. And so relative to the other Achaean heroes at Troy, the other Greek heroes, who were kings of famous golden cities like Mycenae or Sparta, Odysseus is very much a kind of second division king. However, he is one of the standout stars of the Trojan War. And this is because he has qualities that enable him to transcend the poverty of his kingdom. So he's a brilliant warrior. He's famous for his courage, for his prowess on the battlefield. But he's also by far the smartest of the warriors on both sides in the Trojan War. He's very clever. He's very inventive. He's devious. He's a dab hand with a trick, with a lie. And as such, he is the particular favourite of the goddess Athena, the great warrior goddess who is simultaneously the goddess of warfare, but also the kind of the domestic sciences and everything that kind of contributes to civilization. And so she values intelligence for its own sake. And over the course of the Trojan War, she's always keeping an eye on him and occasionally appearing to him. And she says to him, she addresses him directly, "You are by far the best of all mortal men, for schemes, for your way with words, while I, more than all other gods, have a name for cunning and shrewdness." And in the Odyssey, there are a number of women who fall in love with Odysseus or who are in love with Odysseus. And among those, I would rank Athena. I think, that there is a kind of love affair there between the mortal and the goddess.
But this business about women falling in love with him is in the future, isn't it? You're doing a Christopher Nolan and you're flashing forward. Because, in fact, Odysseus at this point, Troy is a smoking ruin. He has only one object in mind, and that is simply to get home as quickly as possible to his wife Penelope and his son Telemachus. So his son he hasn't seen since he was a baby, basically, or a toddler. And he's also got a dog that he's very keen on, and the dog is called Argos.
Yes, who Odysseus had raised him as a puppy.
Right. So talk to me about Penelope. What's Penelope like?
So Penelope is obviously more important to the plot than Argos, the dog. So Penelope is the cousin of Helen. And Odysseus, unlike everyone else who'd gone completely mad for Helen, Odysseus had always had eyes only for Penelope. And this is because Penelope is basically very like him. She's very clever. She's very strong-minded. She's absolutely suited to him. So she's a model of what Homer calls homophrosyne, which means kind of like-mindedness. You have a kind of similar sensibility. And Odysseus was so in love with her that prior to the departure of the Greeks for Troy, he had actually tried to get out of having to go to the expedition. This is not in Homer, but people in ancient Greece listening to the Odyssey would have known that Odysseus's devotion to Penelope was such that he tried to pull this trick and get out of going to the war. And he's the only hero of whom such a thing is recorded. So what had he done? When the Greek ambassadors, summoning him to come to join the expedition and go to Troy with them, had arrived in Ithaca, he said, "Oh, I can't come, I'm mad." And they said, "Well, in what way are you mad?" And he said, "Well, look at me. Here I am. I've yoked a horse and an ox, and I'm ploughing a beach with salt. Clearly, I'm absolutely mad." And so most of the Greek ambassadors are persuaded by it. But one of the ambassadors is not fooled by this. And he looks around and he sees that Telemachus's nurse is standing nearby with the baby Telemachus in her arms. And so this ambassador goes over and snatches the baby and places it in front of the horse and ox as Odysseus is driving them along the beach. And what's Odysseus going to do? He has the choice. He can either drive across the little baby, kill it, but not have to go to Troy, or swerve and reveal that he's not actually mad. And so he opts to swerve and not kill his baby son. And he's rumbled. And so he duly has to leave for Troy. And he sets sail at the head of a fleet of 12 ships. And Homer in the Iliad describes their prows flashing crimson. And he's there for the 10 years. He fights heroically. He comes up with the wheeze of the Trojan horse. Troy falls. Odysseus takes lots of loot. He's ready to go back home, him and his 12 ships. And so off they sail.
Right. But the journey home is not quite as simple as the journey there, is it?
That is putting it mildly.
Right. And this is partly because they keep getting distracted, and they're distracted right from the very start. So they set off. The winds blow them west from Troy. They're going along the northern kind of coastline of the Aegean, and they arrive at a place called Ismarus. And there, instead of sort of putting ashore for supplies, shaking hands with the harbour master, exchanging pleasantries with the burghers of the town, Odysseus, by some standards, behaves very poorly.
Well, he has something of the Viking about him, I think it's fair to say. So here is Odysseus talking about what he did at Ismarus. "I laid waste the city and killed the men after dragging their wives from the city, with a great deal of booty as well." And it's fair to say that neither Homer nor any ancient source of which I am aware mentions what happens to these women that Odysseus and his men have kind of dragged off into slavery. I mean, do they die on the voyage? Are they sold? I mean, we just don't know.
Nothing good.
Nothing good, I think. One man in Ismarus is spared, and this is a guy called Maron, who is a priest of the god Apollo, and his family is spared as well. And Maron, to show his gratitude for this, gives Odysseus 7 bars of gold, a silver mixing bowl, and 12 amphorae of wine. And this wine is described as being sweet and undiluted, a drink for the gods. And we mentioned this in our episode on the history of wine. It's a kind of ancient Greek Premier Grand Cru. It is incredibly strong. And Maron suggests to Odysseus that 1 portion of this wine should be mixed with 19 portions of water, and that anyone who drinks it neat is obviously the most monstrous barbarian. So that is just something for listeners to bear in mind.
And Odysseus, he's pleased with all this. He's ready to head off. But again, this is a theme that will recur throughout the Odyssey and indeed these episodes. His men, when he says, right, let's crack on, they've got stuck into the wine, and they're also having a barbecue. Hence the Russell Crowe voice for the beginning, because there's something very Australian about Odysseus's crew. I mean, basically, wherever they stop, they have barbecues and start grilling meat on the beach. And that's a terrible thing to do.
It is, because it enables the locals who've been beaten off to kind of rally and return to the attack with much larger numbers of men. And so Odysseus and his men find themselves horribly outnumbered. They form a shield wall. But as the sun sets on the scene of battle, they're forced to retreat onto their ships, and they manage to escape essentially by the skin of their teeth. And over 70 of his men are left dead. So already the expedition is starting to leech manpower. However, they get away. They sail southwards across the Aegean. They round the southernmost tip of Greece, the southernmost tip of the Peloponnese, Cape Malea. And now all Odysseus has to do is kind of steer around the Cape, head northwards, go around the kind of the edge of the Peloponnese, and there is Ithaca waiting for him. But disaster, because as they round the Cape, a violent storm blows up. Terrible winds blow them and blow them and blow them. They rage for 9 days and nights, and when the 9 days and nights of wind finally calms down, they've got no idea where they are. And on the 10th day, they see land, and they moor there. And Odysseus sends a couple of scouts to go up the beach, head inland, and try and work out where they are. And then he sits there and he waits for them to return, but they don't come back. And so finally he thinks, well, I better go and work out what's going on here. And so he leaves the ship, follows their footsteps, you can track them up the beach, goes inland, and he finds them, and they are they're half asleep. They're all blissed out. They've got a kind of spaced look on their faces, smiling happily. And he tries to kind of rouse them, tells them, come on, we've got to get cracking. And they don't want to move. And finally, he uses force. He kind of physically drags them. And they start to sob. They just want to stay there and chillax and, have fun and be mellow and not go kind of roaring off around the world. They can't be asked to go home. They don't want to. They're enjoying themselves too much where they are. And Odysseus realizes where they are. They have come to the land of the lotus eaters. And Homer explains what this means. Now, whichever of them ate the honey-sweet fruit of the lotus no longer had any desire to send word of themselves or return. And so Odysseus is aware that, if all his crew get out and start munching on the lotus, they will never return home. And so he orders his fleet to leave immediately, because they can't risk losing that, the will for the Nostos, the will for the return home.
So let's just stop the story right there and ask what this is all about. So what do people think the land of the lotus eaters refers to? Is there something in, I don't know, Bronze Age history or something that is the genesis of this idea?
I mean, it's a question that the Greeks themselves asked. So Herodotus, the first historian, he worked out that the land of the lotus eaters must have been on the North African coast, because the winds had been blowing Odysseus in that direction. So this is just kind of due south of Sicily. Victorian scholars thought that probably it was opium. And I think this probably says more about the Victorians than it does about Homer, because it was a great age for opium dens. But it's a very kind of popular idea. There are other theories, which I was kind of looking up for this episode. Apparently there's a small tree called the Sisyphus lotus, but the problem with that is it's not narcotic. And there is apparently a blue lotus, which does have psychotropic properties. So maybe it's that. I don't know. I'm not a specialist in the flora of North Africa.
It's more likely, surely, that this is a literary symbol, the lotus eating, no? That it's basically about losing yourself and losing sight of your goal.
I mean, I think it's important for the whole structure of the poem that you have to completely believe in Odysseus' desperation to get back home, and that his men share in that desperation. And so in a way, the best way to kind of highlight that is to show the alternative, what that would mean. And essentially it just means kind of chilling out and doing nothing, which might have its appeal, but ultimately it's seen as a danger. And so when Odysseus pushes off from the land of the Lotus Eaters, the reader or the listener can feel confident that this is a man utterly committed to getting back home. And this is very important because all kinds of obstacles, as we will see, are going to be waiting for him on his journey back.
Well, let's get to the next obstacle, which is the most famous obstacle of all. So they set off, don't they? They reach another bit of land. So this is a little island. As far as they can tell, the island is inhabited only by wild goats. They have another barbecue, inevitably.
Another Barbie.
And they see that there's a larger island nearby. And on this island, they can see smoke rising into the sky. So that's an interesting and exciting and tantalizing sign. And Odysseus, he goes off on his own, am I right, to find out what's on this island?
There's smoke, but there's no sign of agriculture, which is a puzzle, because they would assume that a settlement people would be tilling fields, but there's no sign of that. And so Odysseus is a little bit nervous about this, not sure what that might portend. And so he sets sail in a single ship. So he leaves the other 11 ships kind of hidden off the smaller island. He goes off, he crosses over to the main island, they land, and they walk along the beach, and they see a cave. And the entrance to this cave is it's walled off with a kind of stone wall. So he thinks, well, this is obviously signs of habitation. And so he decides to investigate, and he takes his 12 bravest men with him. And he also takes with him a goat skin filled with that delicious, very strong wine that had been given to him by Maron, the priest of Apollo. And they go up to the cave and they call out, and there's no answer. And so they decide to kind of wander in and investigate, and they find that it's empty except for lambs and for kids who are in pens, and there are racks and racks of cheeses. So clearly there is someone living here. And Odysseus decides to wait for the owner of the cave to return, and they build a fire and they grill some cheese, and it's like a kind of Mediterranean hiking holiday or something like that. Again, it's this kind of Aussie style obsession with having barbecues at inappropriate moments. They're laid out having this barbecue, and outside the sun is setting, and towards dusk the earth starts to shake. So it's a little bit like the scene in Jurassic Park when the glass of water on the Jeep starts to shake. And it's not a tyrannosaur that appears, but a monstrous giant human figure. And he is driving flocks of sheep and goats ahead of him, and he enters the cave, and as he enters the cave, he blocks out the light. As the eyes of the Achaeans adjust, they look up into his face, and they see that he has only a single eye. So this is a Cyclops, and it's a Cyclops by the name of Polyphemus. And Polyphemus is of immense size and therefore strength, and he picks up a giant boulder and uses it to seal the entrance. It would be completely impossible for Odysseus and his men to move it. And then he looks around with his single eye, and he spots Odysseus and his men cowering at the back of the cave, and he demands to know who they are.
And just to check, do they know what he is? Do they have a sense of him? Or is he something they've never heard of or never seen before?
I think the general vibe is that he's not good news.
Okay.
He's enormous, he's fierce looking, he's got a single eye. I don't think that this is the kind of person that you probably want to run into when you've been grilling his cheese. But he's hopeful that perhaps he could get this guy on his side. And so he conquers his fear and he steps forward and he introduces himself. He introduces himself as an Achaean, but he doesn't really give any more detail. And when Polyphemus asks Odysseus, well, where is your ship? Odysseus lies and says that they've lost it in a storm. He loves a fib. He doesn't want to give away too much because he is clearly nervous about whether Polyphemus is the kind of person you want, within whose cave you want to be stuck. And when Polyphemus learns that their ship has been sunk, he reaches for two of Odysseus's men, smashes out their brains on the floor, devours them, falls asleep, stretched out among his flocks. So there, Dominic, is your answer. He's not good news. He's not the kind of person you want to be stuck in a cave with.
He's blocked them in the cave with a boulder, which is crucial. So they can't just kill him because they wouldn't be able to move the boulder, right?
Exactly so. So they have no choice but to pass this completely miserable night. And in due course, as Homer puts it, morning-born dawn touches the sky with her rosy fingertips. Polyphemus wakes up, and for breakfast, he has two more of Odysseus's men. He smashes them again on the kind of the side of the wall and devours them. And then he moves the boulder, drives out his flocks, and then seals the cave up again with the boulder. So again, Odysseus and his men are stuck there. So, what are they going to do now? This seems an impossible situation. But Odysseus, fortunately, he is blindingly smart. And so he looks around and he realizes that there is a possible way out, because Polyphemus has got a club, and this club is enormous. It's kind of like the size of the trunk of an enormous tree, the length and scale of the mast of a ship. So Odysseus gets his men to whittle this club down to a very, very sharp point. And then when they've done that, they conceal it under kind of sheepskins or whatever. And when Polyphemus returns that evening, he devours two more men. Odysseus steps forward and he offers Polyphemus a cup of Maron's delicious, and did I mention it's very strong, wine.
They brought the wine with them. Crucial.
And Polyphemus is clearly a barbarian because he does not water it down. Instead, he guzzles it down neat. And then when Odysseus comes forward and offers him another 2 cups of this wine, he guzzles that down as well. And once he's had these 3 cups of wine, he asks Odysseus for his name. And Odysseus does not give his real name. Instead, he says, my name is Outis, which means in Greek, no one.
Oh, so clever.
And Polyphemus says, well, as a thank you for the wine, here is what I'm going to do. I will eat you last. Great giant laugh. He then falls asleep. And as he falls asleep, he kind of belches and vomits up wine and bits of hand and bits of flesh, and it all spews out onto the floor of the cave. And Polyphemus just kind of rolls over, vomits up a bit more, and then he's flat out and he's snoring, and the cave echoes to the sound of the snores. And this is the chance that Odysseus has been waiting for. So he and his men, remember, have got this club, which they've sharpened into a spike, and they heat this giant spike in the fire, and then they clamber up the body of the sleeping Cyclops, and they aim it over his single eye. Point rests on the lid. Odysseus gives the signal, and then it's driven deep into the eye of the Cyclops. And to quote Homer, his eyelids and his brows were blistered all round by the blast as the eyeball burned, its roots crackling in the fire. And understandably, Polyphemus screams and howls. He pulls the spike out of his eye and hurls it against the side of the cave and starts bellowing for help. And there are other Cyclops, his neighbours, and they hear his cries, and they come down and they ask him what has happened. And again, to quote Homer, from inside the cave, mighty Polyphemus made his reply, friends, no one is killing me. And so his friends answer, well, if no one is killing you, if no one has harmed you, and it's clearly then just a malady sent by Zeus, you must pray to your divine father for relief. And Polyphemus's divine father is Poseidon, the god of the sea. So a very, very powerful god indeed.
Not good news if you want to get home by sea, right? I mean, to have Poseidon against you.
Absolutely. So brilliant from Odysseus. He's come up with the spike in the eye wheeze, and also the whole, calling himself nobody means that the other Cyclops think that nothing's the matter with Polyphemus. But they're still not out of danger, because what Polyphemus does now is to push back the boulder, because he's got to let his flocks of sheep and goats go out. And as they kind of start milling out through the cave entrance, he feels each one to make sure that Odysseus and his men aren't trying to kind of creep out hidden among the flocks. But again, Odysseus is equal to this challenge. So what he does is he ties each of his men underneath the belly of a sheep, and they all kind of manage to get out, and Polyphemus doesn't realize that they're kind of tied under the bellies of the sheep. And then he himself, there's one giant ram, and he hugs onto the fleece of this giant ram, and the ram trots out. And Polyphemus, he strokes the ram and realizes that this is, his beloved ram, and feels that it's walking slowly because of the weight, but he thinks that the ram is walking slowly out of grief for his blinded master. So very sad. Anyway, Odysseus and his men managed, therefore, to get out of the cave, cut themselves free from the sheep. They drive the entire flock of sheep down towards their ship. They load the sheep onto the boat so that they can kind of roast them later and have another barbecue, and then they pull out to sea. But Odysseus is a warrior, and he wants the person he's defeated to know who has vanquished him. And so he taunts the blinded Cyclops from his ship as it's pulling out. And Polyphemus is so furious that he kind of gropes for the top of a mountain and pulls the summit off and hurls the rock in the direction of Odysseus. And it lands just in front of Odysseus' ship. And there's a great tsunami, and it washes Odysseus' ship back towards the shore. And it looks like they're going to be shipwrecked on it. So Odysseus takes a pole, and it's kind of like a punt, trying to kind of push it off the side of the river. So he pushes their ship back out to sea. He and his men row frantically. And then again, he cannot help himself. And he stands on the rear of the ship, and he yells taunts at Polyphemus again, and fatally reveals his true identity. He announces himself as Odysseus, sacker of cities, the son of Laertes, who holds his home in Ithaca. And when Polyphemus hears this, he gives a great groan, and he raises his arms, and he prays to Poseidon, the god of the sea, his divine father. Hear me, Poseidon, earthshaker, you of the deep blue main. Grant that Odysseus, sacker of cities, may never reach his home, that son of Laertes who holds his home in Ithaca. But if his fate is to see his loved ones once more and make it back home to his strong-built palace and to the land of his fathers, then let him come late and hapless after losing all his comrades on a ship that is not his own, and may he find trouble at home.
That bodes very ill for Odysseus if Poseidon hears his son's prayer. And if Poseidon does hear that prayer, of course, then Odysseus' prospects of getting back to Ithaca with all of his men are hanging in the balance. And we'll find out what happens next after the break. Welcome back to The Rest is History. So our hero Odysseus has been swept by gales and storms far from the familiar waters of Greece and the Aegean, and he has ended up in a very mysterious and murky dimension, a place where people are off their faces on narcotic lotuses, where one-eyed monstrous giants are dashing people's brains out and having them for breakfast. Now, to the original listeners of this story, because people would have listened to it, that have heard it rather than read it, I think, would they have seen these adventures? I mean, is this the stuff of fairy tales and fantasy, or did they think these things really happened?
I mean, on one level, obviously, it is fantasy, but there was a sense that these islands could be located in the geography of the Mediterranean Sea. So we've heard that Herodotus, the first great historian, he located the land of the Lotus Eaters in North Africa. And there was a tradition as well among the Greeks that the cave of Polyphemus had lain beneath Mount Etna in Sicily. And Etna, of course, is a volcano, so there is this sense of fire hidden in the mountain. And the story was that the Cyclops used these fires of Etna to forge the thunderbolts that they then gave to Zeus. and that Polyphemus is one of these Cyclops that were working on the thunderbolts. There is a brilliant theory about why one-eyed giants might have been identified with Sicily. So there's a wonderful book by a paleontologist called Adrian Mayer, who's written about what the ancients thought ancient fossils were. And she suggested that there were dwarf elephants on Sicily, so they'd gone extinct long before ancient Greek times, but their skulls might have been discovered. And because you have the trunk, the nasal cavity, if you look at the skull of an elephant, it does look a little bit like a kind of single eye. I mean, there's no proof for it, but it's a wonderful idea.
Is this not trying too hard to find a sort of banal, mundane explanation for what's clearly a fantastical story? I mean, to me, it would seem like this isn't inspired by skulls of like elephants. This is inspired by the fear of the unknown, the fear of the monstrous, all of that kind of stuff.
I think that the story of these monsters lurking on strange islands, that these are anxieties that are bred of the age in which the Odyssey is being written down. And it's an age when Greek colonists are starting to settle Sicily and the western reaches of the Mediterranean. And I think that Polyphemus is a kind of nightmarish vision of a barbarian who does not live by the rules of life that the Greeks associate with civilization. So that's why Homer specifies that he drinks his wine neat. It's why he specifies that there's no agriculture. These are people who, by the standards of the Greek colonists, are backward and savage and kind of frightening for that reason. So clearly, as you say, I mean, Polyphemus is a figure of fantasy, one of the most memorable figures in the whole history of fantasy. But he is clearly, I think, bringing to life the anxieties of adventurers who are sailing into strange seas and settling lands that are often very hostile. So there is a brilliant book on this by a scholar called Carol Doughty, The Raft of Odysseus. And to quote from that, embedded within a familiar mythic story pattern of a time and people long ago are details and themes that belong to the contemporary world of its audience. And that's kind of what you would expect. And it reminds me a bit of the way in which in the 1960s in Star Trek, if you watch it now, it's Captain Kirk going around, strange planets and all of that. But so many of those episodes are plainly about anxieties and complex that are manifest in 1960s America. And you would think that probably, mutatis mutandis, the same is true of what's going on in the Odyssey, that this is fantastical, but it is also kind of drawing on all kinds of anxieties that reflect the character of the age in Greece.
So let's take the next adventure they have. So this is the island of King Aeolus, and he is what? He's the god of the winds?
Yeah, he's the god of the winds. And on one level, as with the Cyclops, he's plainly a fantastical figure because his island is, it floats and it has ramparts made of unbreakable bronze. And yet at the same time, the Greeks were so confident where his island was anchored that to this day, we call the archipelago of islands the Aeolian Islands.
Oh, yeah, of course.
There was clearly a very, very strong tradition as to where Aeolus had actually been.
I've been to the Aeolian Islands. They're very nice. Lovely.
There you go. You're following in the footsteps of Odysseus. And Aeolus, unlike Polyphemus, is a very civilized man. And he's obedient to the Greek laws of what they call xenia, which is hospitality towards foreigners. If you meet a foreigner, the kind of mutual exchange of gifts. The contrast with Polyphemus is very obvious and deliberate, I think. And Aeolus hosts Odysseus and his men for an entire month in his kind of magnificent palace with its great bronze walls and all of that. And then he places all the contrary winds, the winds that would prevent Odysseus from getting back to Ithaca, in a massive great bag. And he gives this bag to Odysseus to keep in his hold. So you can imagine the bag kind of bulging and moving with all these winds trying to get out, so that the west wind will blow him back home. And Aeolus says, you'll be absolutely fine with this. It's just, just bear in mind the one thing, whatever you do not open that bag. And just to reiterate, whatever you do not open that bag. And so Odysseus, to make absolutely sure that the winds do not escape from the bag, for 9 days and nights, he doesn't sleep. He sits there kind of keeping his eye on the bag. And finally, they are so close to Ithaca that Odysseus can see smoke rising from hearth fires on the island. He is so nearly there. He's been awake all this time, and so fatally he dozes off very briefly. And his men, seeing him asleep, they're aware that he's been watching this bag, and so they start muttering among themselves and say, well, what's in the bag? I mean, why is he so anxious about it? Clearly it must be full of treasure, and he's keeping it for himself, and he's not sharing it with us, and it's not fair. So let's open up the bag and share the treasure out among ourselves before we arrive in Ithaca. And they pull on the rope, they undo the bag, the winds come screaming and howling out of the bag, massive great storms. Odysseus is blown all the way back to the island of Aeolus. And when he goes up to Aeolus and says what has happened...
Have you got any more winds?
Well, basically says, will you put them in the bag again? And Aeolus says, no, get out, for it's clear that you've come here as one hated by the gods. And again, you could see how, if you're venturing, say, into the Western Mediterranean from Greece, a knowledge of the winds is going to be really important. Getting information from local sources would be a requirement for anyone who wants to make a successful voyage. So again, I think you can see how that might feed into a story like this.
Yeah, completely. So things have gone wrong for them. And for the next 6 days, they have to row, don't they? 6 days and nights. And they arrive in this fantastic harbour.
It's a perfect harbour.
Yeah. High cliffs, headlands encircling it. And 11 of the ships go in, and Odysseus's ship stays outside. And this is Odysseus being smart again, because Tom, what happens next?
Yeah, because he can see it's a perfect harbour, but that also makes it a perfect trap. And Odysseus is very sensible not to have just gone ploughing in, because this turns out to be the land of a people called the Laestrygonians, who, again, are giant cannibals, and there are thousands of them. And they all mass on the cliffs that surround this perfect harbour. And again, to quote Homer, from the cliffs they kept hurling down boulders, any one of which a man would be hard-pressed to lift. And the ships, they're trapped inside this harbour, and they are rapidly reduced to matchwood. And the Laestrygonians then wade out into the sea, and they spear Odysseus's men like their fish, like their tuna. And only Odysseus and his now solitary ship escape the slaughter. So people remember that curse that Polyphemus had laid on Odysseus, that he would return without his men. Well, 11 of those ships have gone.
And again, is there a real life equivalent to this? So you were talking about the Aeolian Islands and the Lotus Eaters, explanations of the Lotus Eaters. What do historians think about the Laestrygonians?
The Greeks identified it again with Sicily, and this is a period where they're starting to settle Sicily. And again, I think the story speaks of anxieties about murderous natives. And I think there's the specific twist here, which is you're with your ships, you see a perfect spot for a colony. I mean, it might be a perfect spot, but that might make it all the more dangerous, because perfect spots would presumably already be settled, and there would be people who would not welcome your arrival. So again, I think you can see how these stories of colonization and settlement that are coterminous with Homer's composition of the Odyssey, that this is probably what's going on, probably feeding into stories like that.
Okay, so we've had a few stories that seem quite obviously to reflect anxieties about the Greek age of colonization. But the next adventure is much stranger, isn't it? And this is much more like a sort of going into some fantasy dreamscape or something.
Yeah, again, to kind of pursue the science fiction parallel, this is, you're going through a wormhole or experiencing a singularity. You're going into a different dimension where the rules of what are normal are suspended. However, it's not immediately obvious to Odysseus that this is what has happened. So they've made their escape from the Laestrygonians. They keep sailing as the wind blows them, and they arrive at another island. They moor off it. And at first, everything seems completely normal. Odysseus goes on a scouting mission. He runs into a stag. He kills it. He brings it back. They all have another barbecue. The next day, Odysseus wants to go deeper into the hinterland of the island. So he divides his men into two groups, one led by him, one led by a particularly brave crew member called Eurylochus. And lots are cast to see which of these two groups will go and explore and which will stay and look after the ship. And the lot falls on Eurylochus to go inland and to try and scout out who or what might be on this island. So Eurylochus and his scouting party head inland. And in due course, they come to a beautiful palace with spreading lawns and gardens. And there are wolves and lions in this garden. And so, understandably, Eurylochus's men draw their swords. They're nervous of these predators. But the lions and wolves seem weirdly tame. And they fawn on Eurylochus and his men like they're, domestic dogs. And while they're wondering about this and thinking, what on earth's going on here, from inside the palace, they hear the beautiful voice of a woman, and she's singing. And she's clearly working on a loom. And they call out to her, and this woman comes to them, and she opens these great gleaming doors, and she invites them in. And she is fabulously gorgeous, beautifully dressed. Clearly a queen. And so all Eurylochus's men, except for Eurylochus himself, they walk inside. Eurylochus, who's clearly been chosen by Odysseus because he has a quality of suspicion and intelligence that Odysseus identifies with, he stays outside. He doesn't trust this woman, thinks there's something a little bit sinister about her. And he's not wrong, because the woman seats Eurylochus's men down on couches, and then she brings them food, cheese and barley and tawny honey, together with Pramnian wine. And this food and this drink, we're told, are mixed with sinister drugs. And Eurylochus's men eat and drink their fill, and then once they have gorged themselves, the woman walks around the dining area and she taps them with a wand, and immediately they start turning into pigs. Their heads, their grunts, their bristles, their bodies, although their minds were as sound as they'd always been. So they are humans trapped in the bodies of a pig. And Eurylochus has watched all of this, and he manages to get away, and he runs back to Odysseus, reports it to Odysseus, and from this point on, the story becomes even stranger. So Odysseus is determined to redeem his men from the spell. Aside from anything else, he needs them. He won't be able to kind of row the ship without them. So he sets off to confront this woman who is patently a sorceress. And on his way, he meets, for the first time in the course of his wanderings, a bona fide Olympian, one of the top 12 gods on Mount Olympus. And this is Hermes, the messenger of the gods, so has clearly been sent by someone, we presume Athena, to help him out. And Hermes gives Odysseus an awesome drug of his own. And this is a black-rooted herb with a white flower called the moly. And armed with the moly, and it's unclear exactly what the moly might be based on, but anyway, it's very powerful, has great magic. Odysseus proves immune to the sorceress's spells. And this is despite the fact that we discover this sorceress is herself a goddess. She is a daughter of the sun, and her name is Circe of the beautiful braids. And at sword point, Odysseus forces Circe to submit, and Circe submits and then invites Odysseus to bed. And Odysseus says, "No way, unless you could bear to swear a great oath to me, goddess, not to plot any more evil that is meant to do me harm." And Circe swears the oath, and then Odysseus goes to bed with her. She then restores his men to human form, younger than before, far more handsome now, and much taller to look upon. So that's all worked out well.
But then the twist, you might expect Odysseus to rush off, but he doesn't. He stays for a year. He and his crew stay with Circe for a year, don't they? And actually, Odysseus seems to be enjoying this so much that it's his men who come to him and say, "Have you forgotten about going home? We were meant to be going home. Your house with its high-built roof and the land of your fathers is waiting for you, Ithaca. And come on, let's crack on and leave." And what is going on here, do you think? So is this an allegory for sexual desire? Is it female wiles? What's all this about?
It clearly complicates the notion of Odysseus as a man driven by a kind of, an absolute focus on getting back to Ithaca and to his beloved wife, Penelope. And just, people will obviously be wondering about this. Odysseus is meant to be devoted to his wife. His sexual relationship with Circe is a complete non-issue to Homer. it's expected that a man, no matter how much he may be devoted to his wife, will obviously sleep around him. It's an absolute given. I think there is a kind of eeriness to this episode, though. Obviously, it's not naturalistic because it's a woman who's turning people into pigs. But I don't think we should understand the passage of time here as simply being, he's having a great time. He fails to notice what's going on. And then before you know it, a year's gone by. I think that there's a kind of quality of the shaman about Circe, the sense that she has conducted Odysseus and his men into a dimension of mystery and magic where time moves at a different pace. And so what she's offering Odysseus, I think, is a kind of akin to an initiation. And the year passes pretty much in the blink of an eye. And when Odysseus goes to her and says, look, I really want to carry on, Circe doesn't object to this, but she says, before you do this, you must go even further beyond my island to the dwelling place of Hades and dread Persephone. And Hades and Persephone are the king and queen of the dead. They rule the underworld. And Circe is sending Odysseus on to the land of Hades. Because here in the land of the dead, you've got mist, you've got cloud, it shrouds the farthest boundaries of ocean. If he gets to the land of the dead, he can consult with someone who will be able to tell him the best way to get back home. And this is the great prophet Tiresias. And we have already met him in an episode of The Rest is History, the episode that we did on Oedipus. And he's died and he's now in the underworld. And I think there is something, it's a kind of something of the superhero franchise, isn't there here? That characters who are the star of one film kind of reappear as a bit of a bit part in another.
Yeah, this is the Circe cinematic universe. Actually, have you read Madeline Miller's novel about Circe?
Yes.
Brilliant, isn't it? So it gives you the whole episode from her perspective. Anyway, Odysseus and co, they go off to the land of Hades, and this is something that nobody's ever done before. They're the first ship ever to sail to... I mean, who knew that you could sail there? This was a surprise to me.
This is why you need Circe to tell you such things.
Right.
No one had ever thought to do it before. And also Circe has told him what to do when he lands on the land of the dead, how to get the ghost to talk to him. Because there is a complication. Once you are a ghost, your ability to speak fades very rapidly until you have drunk blood. And so Circe has said, take a load of sheep, dig a trench, then when you've dug the trench, slit the throats of the sheep and fill the trench with blood. The ghosts will be drawn by it like vampires, and you have to keep the dead at bay until Tiresias has drunk. And this is what Odysseus does. Tiresias drinks the blood and then is able to talk. And he gives Odysseus all kinds of brilliant travel tips. So he says, this is the crucial thing you have to bear in mind. You may find yourself landing on an island called Thrinacia, and this island is sacred to Helios, the sun god Hyperion. This is the god mentioned in the opening that you read, Dominic. If you find yourself on this island, no matter what you do not kill and barbecue the cattle. You have the vibe of people who love nothing more than a barbecue. He's absolutely kind of, he's put his finger on them.
Yeah, Australians.
Don't have a barbecue. Just don't do it, because if you do, everything will go wrong. And Tiresias tells Odysseus the details of what will go wrong. You will get back home late and hapless after losing all your comrades on a ship that is not your own. And of course, that is echoing the curse that Polyphemus had laid on Odysseus earlier. And Tiresias goes on and says that if you and your men kill this cattle, you will find your halls when you get back home filled with braggarts pestering and courting your wife. So just don't go there. So Tiresias, he's drunk his fill, and then he gives this advice, and then he kind of flits away in a kind of spectral manner. And then all the other shades start to feed on the blood. And I think, an incredibly sinister scene. And then Odysseus talks to some of them, and among them is his mother, who had died while he was away in Troy. He hadn't realized that she was dead. And 3 times he tries to embrace her, and 3 times she just kind of melts in his arms like a shadow or a dream. He meets Agamemnon, the king of men, the commander of the Achaeans at Troy. He's been murdered by his wife Clytemnestra, and so he tells Odysseus the story of that. And then very famously, Odysseus meets the great hero of the Iliad, the greatest of all the Achaean warriors, Achilles, the man who at the end of the Iliad had killed Hector, the greatest of the Trojan warriors. And Achilles had been offered the choice when he was very young of a life short but full of glory, or a long life but living in obscurity. And Achilles tells Odysseus, I made a terrible mistake. I went for the short life full of glory, but I would far rather live off the earth as the serf of another man, some man with a pitiful portion who barely ekes out a living, than rule here as the lord of all those who are dead and gone.
So to me, that is the single most interesting moment of the entire Odyssey, because it undermines the cult of the hero and the sort of the emphasis on glory and martial vigor and writing your name in neon letters that will never fade and all of that kind of thing. And basically, Homer is implying that there is an argument for saying, it's a bit like in the Madeline Miller book, Circe, this is what Telemachus says, it's better to be obscure. It's actually better to have a nice, quiet life and no one knows you even exist than to be a great hero and, to be wreathed in glory and stuff. That is all, that all passes and it's meaningless.
Yes, I think that's absolutely what it's saying. But also what Achilles is saying essentially is the greatest of all gifts is immortality. You never want to die. If you ever get offered the gift of immortality, you want to embrace it with open arms. I mean, that is essentially what he's saying. And that is something that will impact on a decision that Odysseus has to make in due course. But we will come to that.
But do you think Homer genuinely means it, that his listeners should have a think about their cult of glory and all of that, or not?
I think that it is one of the things that shadows the Greek devotion to competition, to heroism, to courage, to glory, is the fact that there is no equivalent of the Christian or Muslim heaven for all but the very greatest. That death is a shadowy, dull existence where you're a kind of a gibbering shadow who has to drink blood even to speak. I mean, it's, there's nothing there. And so it makes the blaze of life all the more kind of glorious. So anyway, as you say, I mean, it is an amazing, amazing moment in the poem and in the kind of broader sweep of ancient Greek culture. So Odysseus has got what he came for. He's got this advice from Tiresias. And so now he goes back to the lady Circe, who feasts them. And then after the meal, she says to Odysseus, okay, just go. As soon as dawn appears, set sail. And she then advises him on how he should negotiate the various dangers that will be awaiting him on the next stage of his voyage. And she says, you are going to be passing the island of the Sirens. And these are carnivorous creatures, heads of women, bodies of birds. They have irresistibly beautiful voices. So that's what the word siren means. And they sit on this island perched amid a great pile of bones. And Circe has a suggestion. She says, all your men should put wax in their ears so they can't hear it. And you, if you want to hear the song of the sirens, get your men to tie you to the mast and you will hear the song. You will order them to set you free. Tell them on no account to set you free. And that way you can hear the song of the sirens and live to tell the tale. And then after that, you will pass two terrible monsters, Scylla and Charybdis. And these guard the passage between two cliffs and you have to sail between them. And in one of these cliffs, and this is a cliff which reaches all the way up to wide heaven and is ringed by a cloud of dark blue, there is a cave. And inside this cave lurks the monster Scylla. And Scylla makes a noise like a little newborn puppy. So it's woo, 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 woo. So very, very sweet. However, Scylla has 6 necks, enormously long, and on top of each of the necks is a head harrowing sight, each with 3 rows of teeth. So not good news, a bit like the alien in the Sigourney Weaver film. And from the other cliff sprouts a huge wild fig tree, and beneath that, in the depths of the waters, lurks Charybdis. This is the second monster, and every day Charybdis sucks the water down, and then thrice each day she vomits it up, thrice she gulps it back down. And this creates a monstrous whirlpool, and any ship that gets caught in the whirlpool is doomed. It will be dragged round and round, down and down into the jaws of Charybdis, and everyone on that ship will be eaten. And so Circe's advice is steer clear of the whirlpool, stick close to Scylla's rock, for as Circe says, it is better by far to mourn 6 of the men from your ship than to mourn all of them together. And as for the cattle of the sun, which Tiresias had been majoring on, Circe says, look, just don't land there. It's too dangerous. She's obviously sussed out the enthusiasm of Odysseus' men for barbecues and says, just Don't let them have the temptation. So Odysseus has got this advice from Circe. He follows it to the letter. He does indeed become the only man to have heard the Sirens sing and live to tell the tale. He does lose 6 men to the 6 snaking necks of Scylla that kind of descend from her cave and grabs them and kind of pulls them up into her cave and devours them. But they manage to avoid the whirlpool of Charybdis, and that's the main thing. And they sail on and they see the island of the sun. And Odysseus says, okay, we're not stopping here. No way.
Because this is the bit, remember, Tiresias, you're better to avoid it. Do not touch them. Of course, as soon as Tiresias said that, surely we all knew what was going to happen.
Yeah. Odysseus's men, when he says, look, we're not stopping here, they all complain. They say, look, oh God, we're shattered. We really need a break. It looks really nice. Please, come on. So very reluctantly, Odysseus says, okay, but guys, whatever you do, don't touch the cattle. Just don't go there. We will stop there for a single afternoon and then we will continue on our way. So they land. And then, unfortunately, the moment they land, there is a massive, great storm, and it blows for a month, and it is clearly of divine origin. It is preventing them from leaving the island. And so they're stuck there, and they're really, really hungry. Their supplies are running out. And Odysseus can see his men starting to eye up the cattle and thinking how nice, chunks of this cattle would be if it were on a spit, in a lovely kebab. And so in desperation, he thinks, well, listen, clearly there is a god here who's angry. I need to get up onto the top of the mountain at the center of this island and raise a prayer there. So that's what he does. And he leaves his men behind and he heads off to the summit of the mountain on the top in the middle of the island to raise prayers to the gods. And presumably before he goes, he does remind them, guys, don't eat the cattle. Don't eat the cattle. Did I mention don't eat the cattle? He reaches the mountain top. As before, with the winds of Aeolus in the bag, so now, fatefully, he falls asleep. So there's something of the Lafayette about Odysseus falling asleep at crucial moments. And as he sleeps, his men obviously do what they've been told not to do. They kill and roast the sacred cattle, and the smell of kebabs drifts into the nostrils of Odysseus. He wakes up, he looks down, he sees the smokes rising, he goes, oh no! And he runs down, and for 6 days his men make a feast. The wind, they can't leave because of the winds. But it is very obvious that nothing good is going to come of this barbecue because the skins of the slain cattle keep moving around. And the meat on the kebab sticks keeps lowing.
That's like a vegan's fantasy, isn't it?
Yeah. And it's not surprising because it is, I think, hard to overemphasize the scale of the insult that has been done to the sun god because these are clearly solar cattle. And notions of solar cattle seem to have been very widespread in the myths of the ancient Indo-Europeans. So the Greeks are Indo-Europeans. You get it in Hindu mythology and Irish mythology, from India to Ireland, in other words. And their theft in all these stories, no matter where they're told, it always represents a kind of massive insult to the cosmic order. And so it is in the Odyssey. Helios, the sun god, complains to Zeus. Zeus stills the storms. So there's a very sinister calm, and this allows Odysseus and his men to set sail. And then all at once the ship is out at sea, Zeus thundered and hurled his lightning at the ship. And the mast of the ship snaps, and as it falls, it brains the helmsman and knocks him into the sea, so they now have no one to steer them. The ship spins round and round. The decking blazes with smoke like sulphur. And all of Odysseus's men are tossed into the kind of the great boiling roil of the sea. Looking just like cormorants, they bobbed about on the waves all around the black-hulled ship. The god snatched their homecoming from them. But only one man survives the shipwreck, and this is Odysseus himself. Somehow he manages to fashion a raft out of all the wreckage, all the flotsam and jetsam. But even now, even though he's got his raft, he's still not safe because the wind changes and blows him back the way he had come towards Scylla and Charybdis. And of course he can't steer, so the whirlpool is swirling downwards, Charybdis is sucking the water down deep into her jaws, and Odysseus's raft gets caught up in the kind of the spinning and the whirling of the waters. As it's going down, Odysseus leaps up from the raft and he clings onto that giant fig tree, remember, which Homer had told us was leaning over the whirlpool, and he manages to hold onto it until the raft is spat back up by Charybdis, and he drops down from the branch that he's been holding onto, down beside the timbers, and sitting on top of them, as he later describes it, I used my hands to paddle away. And for 9 days and 9 nights he drifts, and he is the only man left alive out of what had originally been a fleet of 12 ships. And the loss of those men in Homer's poem is very deeply felt, because the Odyssey, throughout the account of its hero's voyages, and obviously the focus is very much on the hero, nevertheless it is unusual for the emphasis that it places on the minor characters. You kind of come to know them. We haven't really been talking about them much because we haven't had the time, but when you're reading the poem, you feel for them. You mark their fates, even if they are idiots with their enthusiasm for barbecue.
I mean, they've only got themselves to blame, to be honest. And again, Scylla and Charybdis, all of this stuff, you can see how this reflects the anxieties of an age of exploration and sea travel. The whirlpool, the cliffs, all of that.
Yeah, so Scylla and Charybdis was identified with the Straits of Messina between Sicily and Italy, where you have whirlpools and riptides, and it was generally dreaded by ancient sailors. And Thrinacia, the island of the cattle, means 3 headlands. Sicily has 3 headlands. So again, it was identified with Sicily. And Sicily was the kind of main focus for Greek colonization in this period. So it's perhaps not surprising that it generated all these myths. But now, with the loss of his men and his ship, Odysseus, I think, is drifting back from the kind of the shipping lanes that Greek sailors might recognize, back into a dimension beyond the mortal, back through the kind of the Homeric equivalent of a wormhole. And it's telling, I think, that Homer does not describe in detail what happens next. All he really reports is that after 9 days of drifting on the open seas, and this is Odysseus narrating at this point, on the 9th of the 10th, I was brought by the gods to the island of Ogygia, home of Calypso, she of the beautiful braids, dread goddess who speaks like a mortal. She welcomed and cared for me.
So it's slightly Circe-like, but the difference here is that whereas he stayed with Circe voluntarily, Calypso will not let him leave. That's right, isn't it? He's staying here almost against his will, day after day, month after month, year after year. He is, weeping. He's thinking about Penelope. He's thinking about his son Telemachus, about Ithaca, his home, and the greatest punishment of all. Every night he has to go to bed with Calypso. What a terrible ordeal this must have been.
Yes, to quote Homer, compelled by the goddess to do so, he unwilling, she all too willing. So basically, Dominic, he's become a beautiful goddess's sex slave. So a terrible fate.
Oh no, what a terrible fate that is. So, wow. Will he ever escape, Tom? And if so, how will he do it? And what will happen when he gets back to Ithaca? Let us now speed Hermes, the guide, the slayer of Argos, toward Ogygia Island, so that he can speedily announce your steadfast decision to the nymph of the beautiful braids, that Odysseus, whose mind stands fast, shall make his journey home. For my part, I will embark for Ithaca, there to breathe purpose into his son, that I might instill a man's courage within his heart, and to make him call an assembly of the long-haired Ithacans and tell all the suitors to go. Those men who never leave off slaughtering throngs of his sheep and his lumbering twisty-horned cattle. To Sparta I shall send him, and to sandy Pylos too, to learn whatever he can of his dear father's journey home, and to help him as well to earn a noble renown among men. So that was Dame Edna Everage playing the goddess Athena. And Athena is talking to her father Zeus, king of the gods. And this is in the first of the 24 books that constitute Homer's great epic, the Odyssey. And as we were saying in our first episode, there is something very Australian about the expedition of Odysseus and his men across the Aegean, barbecuing on the beach, drinking unnecessarily, behaving badly, and basically comporting themselves like Australians on the beaches of the Dardanelles. And so we felt that Australian voices, Russell Crowe in the last episode, a cross between Kylie Minogue and Dame Edna and this one were the most appropriate.
I was imagining Kylie, I have to say.
Really? It turned into Dame Edna.
If I shut my eyes, I could imagine Kylie, and then I'd open my eyes and see you, and it would all go.
Yeah, nice. That's a lot. I mean, a lot of people's fantasy, actually. Anyway, the translation there is by Daniel Mendelsohn, who's on our bonus episode for Rest is History Club members, talking about the Odyssey. Of course, we're doing this series because the film by Christopher Nolan is out this week. It goes on general release on the 17th. And Tom, I know you've gone online, haven't you, to book your tickets because you don't want to miss out. Is that right?
Actually, I went to the preview.
Okay, that's just showing off, isn't it? It's just showing off. It's the sort of boastful behaviour that you would expect of a Greek hero, I guess.
Yeah, it's Achaean behaviour, and I will regret it when I end up in the underworld.
So, recap to remind people where we are in the story. In the first episode, we heard how Odysseus, the wiliest, the smartest of all the Greek heroes, fought for 10 years in the Trojan War. He was the maestro behind the Trojan horse. Then he tries to get home with his men and he is blown fatally off course. And Tom, remind us of all his adventures and what happened.
So loads of mad adventures, one-eyed giants, beautiful sorceresses. He goes to the underworld, meets the ghost of his mother and various of his fallen comrades. And he ends up losing all his fleet. He had 12 ships. They end up all completely destroyed. And all his men. He is the only survivor of the entire expedition. And he has been washed up on the mysterious island of Ogygia, ruled by a nymph, the Lady Calypso, that radiant goddess. And on Ogygia, he has been kept essentially as Calypso's sex slave for 7 long years. And every night he would spend with the nymph, doing as she commanded. And every day he would weep for Penelope, his beloved wife, his soulmate. And Ogygia is described by Homer as being the omphalos of the sea, the navel of the sea, a place so remote that Plutarch, who was writing in the 2nd century AD, so centuries after Homer wrote it, would place it 5 days sail west of Britain. So that would make it, what, Newfoundland, I guess, or...
Yeah, I mean, somewhere on the way to Canada, anyway.
Yeah, but I think Plutarch is wrong, because in truth, Ogygia is a place that transcends geography and, in fact, time, because its meaning in Greek, Ogygios, it means primal, before the dawn of time. So essentially, Odysseus has passed into a strange dimension where the conventional rules that govern mortals no longer apply. And he has vanished from the world of humans. And Calypso actually means in Greek, she who veils, she who conceals. So it's the same root as apocalypse, which means an unveiling. So Odysseus can't escape, partly because she won't let him go, but also I think because it is impossible for him to get out of this kind of strange dimension that she controls and coordinates. But the reason also why Odysseus can't escape, and people who listen to our first episode may recall this, is because Odysseus very foolishly has offended Poseidon, who is the god of the sea, and he'd done this by blinding his son, the one-eyed giant Polyphemus. And so Poseidon, he doesn't necessarily want Odysseus dead. He's perfectly happy to leave him on this kind of island prison with Calypso as the governor. And as far as Poseidon is concerned, he can just stay there and rot and never get back home.
But Odysseus has a powerful protector of his own, doesn't he? And this is the person who we heard voiced by Dame Edna at the beginning of the episode. So this is another Olympian, and this is Athena. And she likes Odysseus because she sees him as like-minded, because they're both very wise and clever.
Yes, I think she sees something of herself in Odysseus. And so during the Trojan War, she had spoken to him. She'd occasionally appeared to him. Over the course of his adventures, she has not appeared to him or spoken to him because she doesn't want to offend Poseidon. Fortunately, however, as the Odyssey opens, Poseidon is in the land of the Ethiopians, who are not to be identified with the people who live in what today we call Ethiopia. Their name means people with burned faces, so people on the edges of the world where the sun is at its brightest. They're blessed, they're noble, they're the kind of people that a god would like to spend time having a holiday with. And so Poseidon is away from Olympus. And so this gives Athena her chance. And as we heard in that passage with which we opened, voiced by Kylie / Dame Edna, Athena has a two-pronged strategy. So the first is to get Zeus to send Hermes, the messenger of the gods, to Ogygia to order Calypso to set Odysseus free. And secondly, Athena herself will go to Ithaca, Odysseus' home island, and there visit Telemachus, Odysseus' son, and basically kind of encourage him to man up, to stop being so wet.
So this is the moment actually where the Odyssey begins, right?
Yes.
Where the story that we encounter in the book starts with Athena going to see, is it going to see Telemachus? That's the bit that it kicks off with. Is that right?
Yes. Important for listeners to understand who've not read the book that the epic does not begin with the fall of Troy. It doesn't begin with Odysseus embarking on his adventures. So not basically as we did it in the previous episode. It begins with this moment, with Athena going down to see Telemachus. And 10 years have passed since the fall of Troy. So 20 years since Odysseus had left Ithaca. And people may remember that when he'd left Ithaca, Telemachus was just a baby. But now he is a young man. But to be fair to Telemachus, I mean, he is facing a very challenging situation because Odysseus, before he'd left for Troy, had told Penelope, and I quote, "Once you see our son starting to grow out his beard, marry whomever you wish." In other words, if I'm not back by this point, you should assume that I'm dead. And people know this. And so Odysseus' hall is now crowded with suitors who are slaughtering Odysseus' cattle and sheep and insulting his household. Penelope, she wants to hold out. You know, she's hopeful that Odysseus will come back. You know, she knows her husband. She's confident he'll come back. And so she doesn't want to marry any of these suitors. And so for years, she's been keeping them at bay with, again, a kind of very famous wheeze. It's a kind of, it matches the Trojan horse, her husband's great wheeze. And what she had done was she said to them, "I will marry one of you once I have completed weaving a shroud for Laertes, the father of Odysseus." And so she sat at her loom, weaving at it all day. And then at night, secretly, she would steal down and unpick everything she had done in the day.
Right.
And so the suitors are thinking, oh, this shroud is taking a long time. It's taken about 5 years. But in the end, the scheme is betrayed by one of Penelope's servant girls, one of her maids. And so the scheme is rumbled. But at this point, Penelope is still holding out. You know, she doesn't want to give in. And Telemachus also is kind of backing her. But he's just a young man. You know, he hasn't had his father around. He's not kind of trained in the ways of warfare and wiliness and all of that. He's very, very young and inexperienced. And so this is why Athena has decided to visit him, to offer him the kind of advice and encouragement that he hasn't been getting from his father because his father is absent.
She disguises herself, doesn't she, as an old friend of Odysseus with the excellent name of Mentor.
Yes, she's literally his mentor.
Yeah, and when Mentor arrives, Telemachus is very courteous, he's very generous, but Telemachus is extremely embarrassed that there's basically this massive kind of, it's basically like a stag party that's got...
Yeah, they're all wearing plastic breasts and kind of covering each other with shaving foam, naked.
Yeah. It's basically Weatherspoons at Luton Airport.
Yes.
You know, 8 o'clock in the morning. People are absolutely off their faces already. Like there's all kinds of bants.
So it's miserable for poor Telemachus. So Athena cheers him up, first of all, by saying, actually, I think it's okay. I think your dad is alive and I think he's going to be coming back home soon. And she then says, you should stand up for yourself. You should show your independence, and you could do this in a couple of ways. So you could summon an assembly of all the people of Ithaca and publicly make a stand in front of them against the suitors. And then when you've done that, you could go and visit some of Odysseus's old mates, some of his comrades from the Trojan War, and find out what they know. And then, to quote Homer, so saying, Athena went off, she of the bright owl eyes, just as a bird will fly off in a flash, and into his heart she put fierceness and strength. And this fierceness and strength, as we've been saying, is something that hadn't previously been evident in Telemachus. And so the suitors, he holds this public assembly for the Ithacans as Athena had advised. And the suitors go there and they shout it down. But they are startled that Telemachus has had the initiative and the gumption to call it, and a little bit worried about this sudden display of kind of character and independence. And even Penelope is surprised by the way in which her son is suddenly showing a kind of assertiveness. So that's a marker that he's laid down for the suitors. And then he heads off for the mainland, and he does it without telling them what he's doing. He slips away unnoticed, and he heads off to the mainland of Greece, to the Peloponnese, and there he's going to visit two of his father's old comrades in arms. And the first of these is a guy called Nestor, who is the king of Pylos on the west coast of the Peloponnese, and he had been the oldest warrior who'd fought at Troy, fabulously ancient and doddery and long white beard and all of that. And unfortunately, Nestor has no idea where Odysseus is, so he's not much use. But he says it's like he's vanished off the face of the earth. I've heard no rumours about him whatsoever. But he kind of cheers Telemachus up by telling him war stories. Nestor's an old man, and so the joke is that this is all he ever does, is tell stories about the good old days. But these are stories that feature Odysseus being an absolute legend. I mean, kind of literally. And he tells stories about how brave Odysseus had been, how clever, and how close he had been to Athena. So Telemachus had seen Mentor turn into a bird and flash off. So it's, the cogs in his brain are starting to whir, thinking maybe Athena is on the scene. And certainly the effect of Nestor and his conversation is to make Telemachus feel proud to be the son of such a man and make him want to be kind of worthy of such a father. And so from Pylos, Telemachus then heads inland to Sparta, where the king is Menelaus, and he is the husband of Helen, whose abduction had led to the entire war. And Helen, when she comes in to join Menelaus and Telemachus in the great feasting hall, she immediately recognizes him as Odysseus' son, because Helen is the daughter of Zeus. She has a kind of witchy quality. She has kind of supernatural powers. And Helen sits with Telemachus and she tells him a story about Odysseus, how back in the days of the Trojan War, he had infiltrated Troy disguised as an old beggar, and that he had disguised himself so effectively that he'd had himself lashed across his back like a slave, so that when he came into Troy, people could see these marks, and it would have seemed impossible to the Trojans to think that this could actually have been a great hero. And Helen boasts to Telemachus, "I alone saw through his disguise." And of course she could have betrayed him, but she chooses not to. And she says, "For by then my heart had long since been bent on going back home." And Menelaus then tells a story also about Odysseus, how they've built the Trojan horse, and the Greek heroes, the Achaean heroes, have hidden themselves inside the great belly of the horse. And then Helen had come down to them and started calling out in the voices of their wives. So again, this is the kind of the witchy quality of Helen. And it's undermining her claim, actually, that she was now on the Greek side.
I was about to say, she's playing both sides.
Yeah, she is playing both sides.
Yeah.
And the men inside the horse, they hear that what seems to be their wives, they're so homesick, they're so longing for their wives, that lots of them want to kind of call out and reply. But Odysseus knows what's going on. He keeps very silent. He keeps them motionless. He puts his hand over the mouths of those who look as if they're about to call out. And these two stories, the story firstly told by Helen, then by Menelaus, again, they're illustrating the qualities of Odysseus, how intelligent he is, how bold, how daring, and also how self-disciplined he is. But the most crucial thing that Menelaus tells Telemachus is that he does actually have news of Odysseus. And this is because he had ended up on his journey back from Troy in Egypt. And there he had captured the old man of the sea. He's called Proteus, who is a kind of shepherd of seals, has all kinds of weird supernatural powers, able to change his shape. So that's where the word protean comes from. But Menelaus had captured him and held him despite all this shape-shifting, and finally had got Proteus to reveal to him all kinds of things. And among the things that Proteus had revealed is the fact that Odysseus is alive. And to quote what Proteus had told Menelaus, I saw Odysseus on an island, his eyes brimming over with tears in the halls of the nymph Calypso, who is holding him there by compulsion. He is not able to return to the land of his fathers. So now Telemachus knows he is alive.
So that's where we left Odysseus last time. And we left on the cliffhanger, is he ever going to escape from the arms of Calypso? And I'm happy to say that the answer is yes. And this is down to Athena, isn't it? Because basically, we said that she does two things. She goes to see Telemachus, but she also goes to see Zeus.
Yes, her father. And Athena is Zeus's favourite daughter. Poseidon is absent. And so Athena is basically kind of sassing around Olympus, trying to sort things out for Odysseus and hassling her father. And finally, Zeus gives in to her and sends Hermes, the messenger of the gods, down from the summit of Olympus all the way to the island of Ogygia, this navel of the sea. And when Hermes arrives there, he tells Calypso, you've got to let Odysseus go. And Calypso has a massive strop about it. And Hermes says, do not provoke Zeus to anger. Do not make him angry. And so very reluctantly, Calypso permits Odysseus to build a boat, and she gives him provisions and says, okay, you can go. But before he goes, she makes him a great offer, and she offers him the gift of immortality if he will stay with her. And listeners may remember that in the previous episode, we talked about how Odysseus had met with Achilles, the great hero, who is now just a kind of a shadow in the underworld. And Achilles had basically said, life is so much better than death that you should embrace any opportunity you can to perpetuate it. So this is a massive, massive offer. But Odysseus turns it down. And it's one of the great eulogies in ancient literature to the joys and the comforts of marital love. It has to be said there aren't actually that many. And it begins, it doesn't sound like a eulogy to his wife, it has to be said, but it kind of pivots. So Odysseus says to Calypso, look at my wise Penelope. She falls far short of you, your beauty, your stature. But she is mortal, after all. She's not a goddess, so you'd expect that. You never age or die. Nevertheless, I pine all my days to travel home and see the dawn of my return. So he would rather live with Penelope and die than live with Calypso and live forever. And it's a kind of moving moment, I think.
Not many wives who would welcome that tribute to themselves that begins with them saying, she falls far short of you. Anyway, Odysseus sets off from Ogygia, and these things always end up going one way, don't they? But actually at first, it's a bit like the Titanic. Everyone talks about the bit where it went wrong, but no one talks about the first couple of days. So in this case, the first 17 days of the voyage are a triumph. But then on the 18th day of the voyage, Poseidon is on his way back from the land of the Ethiopians, and he sees Odysseus below him, doesn't he? So Poseidon is in the sky.
Yeah, and it's just this tiny little dot. But he's a god. I mean, of course he can recognize him. He's furious about it, and so he strikes the sea with his trident, churns it up, pulverizes Odysseus' raft, all the gifts that he's been given by Calypso, all his provisions, even his clothes, he loses them all. So he's now kind of naked, literally naked in the salty, boiling sea, almost drowns. There's an island ahead. He's almost smashed onto the rocks by the waves. And in fact, had it not been for Athena, who personally intervenes to save him, he would have been killed. But as it is, with the assistance of the goddess, he is able to crawl himself up onto a sandy beach, and he totters up into a nearby wood. And there's kind of leaves scattered around everywhere. So he hides himself under the leaves and understandably collapses, falls completely asleep, and sleeps for who knows how long. But then abruptly, he is woken by the sound of a ball splashing into a pond and the sound of girls shouting and giggling. And obviously, when you've been through a series of adventures that involve giants devouring your men or spearing you in harbours or whatever, I mean, these are the kind of things that you want to hear. He's still dreading the worst because he's gone through so many terrible experiences. But he thinks, oh, well, maybe, they're just girls. Maybe it's all right. And also, he's desperately hungry. He's desperately thirsty. And so he picks up a kind of a branch with leaves on, a bit like Adam in the Garden of Eden. He uses it to conceal his nakedness, and he steps out and emerges from the wood. And in a clearing, it's the most domestic scene imaginable. It is a group of girls doing the laundry, and they look round and see what seems to be this awful kind of briny pervert, stark naked, who stepped out from the woods like a kind of flasher. And they understandably scream and run away. But one of the girls does stay and bravely stands her ground. And Odysseus addresses her from a distance. He doesn't want to frighten her. And he talks to her with absolutely perfectly pitched flattery. So he compares her to Artemis, the daughter of mighty Zeus. And he narrates his ordeals, and then he appeals to her for help. And finally, and I love this moment, and I think it's clearly betraying his own longing for Penelope. He's seeing this girl, and he's thinking of his own family. And he wishes her a happy marriage. And he says, "For there's nothing as powerful or as great as when a husband and wife, united by oneness of mind in their thinking, keep their home together, a great bane to their enemies, a blessing to their friends, and their renown is on everyone's lips." And Sadie and I had that at our wedding.
Oh, nice.
Which we had in a church. But important to emphasize, this is very much not a Christian ideal of marriage. This is an ideal of marriage in a world in which it is households rather than individuals who are being joined. And so to be a bane of one's enemies, a blessing to one's friends, this is a dream that's particularly suited to royal couples, because obviously the whole health of a city, of a kingdom, can depend on it.
Yeah.
And as it turns out, Odysseus's words are perfectly suited to the young girl that he has addressed them to, because the girl that he is addressing is not an ogress, not a witch, not a ghost, but a mortal princess.
So the name of this princess is Nausicaa. She's the daughter, we're told, of Alcinous the Great-Hearted. And in his hands lie the power and might of the Phaeacians. And who are these people?
So the Phaeacians, to the degree that the Odyssey offers one, is a kind of a vision of an ideal society. So Nausicaa's parents, the king and queen of the Phaeacians, Alcinous, the king, they are wise and generous. They have no idea who Odysseus is, but they greet him with great kindness and hospitality. So that this great quality of xenia, which is so important to the Greeks, welcoming strangers with hospitality. They have a kind of perfect microclimate. So their fruit, their vines, their vegetables are always in season. There's no winter. And they have kind of incredible 1950s science fiction style labor-saving devices. So kind of robotic guard dogs made of gold and silver. And they have ships powered by what sounds a little like AI.
Wow.
Kind of that's free thinking. They can think faster than any human being. And these ships can travel at a completely miraculous speed. It can kind of travel the length of the Mediterranean.
Self-sailing ships.
Self-sailing ships, yeah. So again, it's this familiar thing that we were talking about in the first episode, that you have the fantastical element of an island, but then also there are points of similarity with actual islands that exist in the Mediterranean.
Right.
And so to Homer's original audience, the location and the description of the kind of physical geography of Phaeacia made it seem like it was the island of Corcyra, which is now Corfu. And we did a bonus with Alex Preston about this for club members. Go and listen to that. And as we've said, Nausicaa, this princess who's doing the laundry and playing, with a ball with her friends and stuff. I mean, this is a world away from the island of Calypso or Circe or whatever. And most amazingly of all, and it's one of the great, the great kind of postmodern moments in the Odyssey, there is a bard at Alcinous's court who seems like Homer himself. So Homer traditionally is said to be blind, and this guy is blind. And it may well be that description is what gives rise to the legend that Homer was blind. And he's inspired by the Muses, as Homer was thought to be, and he reduces grown men to tears with the power and the pathos of his epic singing. And this blind poet sings to the court at Phaeacia, and among the men at this course, of course, is Odysseus himself. And the bard is singing about the Trojan War and about the feats of arms that Odysseus himself had performed at Troy. And Odysseus weeps to hear them. It's noticed. And so, Alcinous says, "Stranger, why do you weep?" And Odysseus finally reveals who he is. And it is this which prompts him to tell the story of his adventures. So the Lotus Eaters and the Cyclops and everything. So this is the narrative that we told in episode 1. So it's brilliantly, brilliantly meta.
You were saying that it's kind of postmodern book, and of course there's loads of stories within stories, aren't there, in the Odyssey? That's how it works. So you can see what would appeal to a filmmaker.
Yeah.
Flashbacks and things like that.
Yes. And particularly one like Christopher Nolan, who loves all these kind of games with time and so on. And so Odysseus, he tells his story, and at the end, everyone is silent, held absolutely spellbound all through the shadowy palace. And Alcinous the king, is so moved that he says, well, we've got to get you back to your home. We've got to get you back to Ithaca. And so at last, 20 years have gone by, but now Odysseus is ready to go home. And Alcinous loads one of these kind of free sailing AI-powered ships with all kinds of gifts. And Odysseus boards it, and he curls up and he falls asleep, and the ship speeds across the seas. Miraculous power. The morning star rises, and as the morning star rises, this ship reaches Ithaca at last, and the Phaeacian crew lift the still sleeping Odysseus out of the ship, and they place him and all the gifts that Alcinous had given him on a beach under an olive tree. And then we're told they themselves went back, speeding homewards. And so it is, in the most unglamorous, the most kind of anticlimactic manner possible, that Odysseus returns to Ithaca. And as had been foretold, he has done so not on his own ship, but on someone else's ship. And he has arrived there alone, but he is at home at last.
But is this the end of his troubles? Spoiler alert, it is not. His troubles are only just beginning, and we'll find out why after the break. Hear me, daughter of Zeus, whose shield is thunder, standing by me always in every combat mission. No maneuver of mine slips by you. Now again, give me your best support, Athena, comrade. So that was Odysseus talking to Athena. Now that's actually not from the Odyssey, it's from the Iliad, as translated by Robert Fagles. It's a sign of the closeness, I guess, between Athena and Odysseus. They've been in secret communication with each other, these two masters of the dark arts and wiles and wisdom. Athena has spoken different ways to Odysseus through the stories. So in that passage, she's actually speaking to Odysseus in the voice and the cry of a heron. But for the length of his voyage, for the 10 years of his voyage, Athena has been very quiet. And the reason is that she didn't want to offend her fellow Olympian, Poseidon. But now at last, Tom, Athena is back.
She absolutely is. And, to have her on the scene for Odysseus is obviously brilliant news. But remember, at this point, he doesn't know where he is. So just to give people a reminder of where we are at the story. Odysseus' wife, Penelope, is in his palace. There are 108 suitors by this point, all kind of competing for her hand in marriage. And they are all of them kind of insolent, violent, and in fact, murderous. And I say murderous because people may remember that Telemachus had gone off on his voyage to see Nestor and Menelaus on the mainland of Greece. He is now sailing back from mainland Greece to Ithaca. And the plan of the suitors, now that they've rumbled where he's gone, is to ambush and kill him at sea before he can reach Ithaca. So that's bad news for Telemachus. Meanwhile, Odysseus, as we described at the end of the previous half, he has been left asleep beneath an olive tree on Ithaca. And when he wakes up, you said he has no idea where he is.
Yeah.
And so he fears the worst. He thinks, oh no, this is another terrible trick. Poseidon is still kind of intervening to make my life hell. And so he trudges mournfully, we're told, along the shore of the endlessly clamouring sea, kind of wondering, where am I? And then ahead of him, he sees a very handsome young shepherd lad. And so he hails the shepherd lad and says, "Where am I?" And the shepherd boy answers, "Sir, you are in Ithaca." So you would think at this news that Odysseus would, he'd kind of explode with joy, but he's Odysseus. He doesn't. He disguises his delight, and instead invokes the cunning in his heart and tells this absolute kind of cock and bull story about how he's actually a fugitive from Crete. I mean, it's kind of making things up just for the joy of making things up. And the shepherd boy kind of listens to this story and then starts laughing. It's not a shepherd's boy's laugh, it's a woman's laugh. And she starts stroking him with her hand and materializes before him as this beautiful, towering woman. And it is, of course, Athena. And she says to him, "A man would have to be crafty, a sly old fox, to outdo all your tricks." She loves it. She can't get enough of Odysseus' tricks. She thinks it's great.
So she basically explains to Odysseus the situation. This is what's going on with all the suitors, and this is how you're going to deal with it. And she has a plan, doesn't she? So she's basically going to disguise him. She's going to turn him into a beggar so that you will look vile in the eyes of all the suitors and your wife, as well as your child.
Yes. And so she turns him into this kind of hideous old beggar. And then when she's done that, she says, "Go to the hut of the local swineherd Eumaeus, who Odysseus remembers from when he was in Ithaca 20 years before. And this is a man who is still loyal to Odysseus and to his house, so Telemachus and Penelope. And meanwhile, Athena tells Odysseus, "I am going to go and I'm going to escort Telemachus safely back so that the suitors' plan to murder him is foiled." And all of this is what duly comes to pass. So Odysseus, he's disguised as a beggar. He goes to Eumaeus' hut. Eumaeus treats him with great hospitality, with great generosity. He's just a humble swineherd, but, again, he's kind of model of Xenia, of kind of hospitality. It soon becomes clear to Odysseus that Eumaeus is utterly devoted to Odysseus's memory. He remains completely loyal to him. But despite this, Odysseus is Odysseus, so he doesn't reveal himself. Again, he comes up with some mad story, says he's a Cretan. And there's a bit of a joke here, I think, because in antiquity, the Cretans were always viewed as notorious liars. So Odysseus is kind of signaling that it's a lie. And he has this kind of great story saying that he'd served as a mercenary in Egypt, and then he'd had a run-in with Phoenician slave traders. And I think the thing that's interesting about this is that it clearly reflects the world in which Homer is writing this epic down, rather than the age in which Odysseus is meant to have missed, because going to serve in Egypt as a mercenary or having run-ins with Phoenician slavers, this is much more appropriate to the 8th or 7th centuries BC than to the Bronze Age.
So it's like the register has kind of slipped.
Yes, slightly.
Yeah.
And it may be that that's the whole point, that this is a lie. Again, this is kind of quite postmodern, that Odysseus is telling a lie, Homer is telling a lie. There's a kind of, hall of mirrors there. Odysseus also, having come up with this kind of, again, this cock and bull story to Eumaeus, he tells Eumaeus, I have news of your master, your missing master, Odysseus. He is on his way home. But Eumaeus, who's believed everything else that Odysseus has told him, all of which is a lie, this one thing which is the truth, Eumaeus does not believe it. And he tells Odysseus, the storm winds have snatched all his renown away. So Eumaeus basically thinks he is at the bottom of the sea. He is drowned and dead.
Now, Telemachus has gone away and the suitors are waiting to ambush him. But Athena saves him, doesn't she? And brings him back safe and sound to Ithaca. He goes straight to Eumaeus' hut. But Eumaeus is out. And now comes one of your favourite moments in the whole story.
It's one of the great, great moments in Homer, because now is the meeting between the father and the son. So Athena, she's disguised Odysseus as a beggar. All that goes. She restores him to his full stature and nobility, gives him a kind of little touch of stardust so he looks even better than normal. And at first, Telemachus just cannot believe that this father who, he doesn't remember at all. He'd just been a baby when Odysseus left. He can't believe that Odysseus is back. But then, to quote Homer, he twined round his noble father, wailed as the tears poured down, and a desperate longing for weeping welled up in both of them. And so father and son, they embrace. Lots of sobbing, but there's a time when the sobbing has to stop because there is a lot of suitor killing to be done. And this is now absolutely Odysseus's purpose. And at first, when he tells Telemachus this, Telemachus is very skeptical because remember, there are 108 suitors and there's only the 2 of them. But Odysseus says, look, I'm a hero. I've killed a lot of people. And also, we have Athena on our side. And on top of that, I am the cleverest man in the world. And I have a cunning plan. So here is my plan. I am going to infiltrate the palace in my brilliant disguise as a beggar. Your role, Telemachus, when the moment comes, is to remove all the weapons that are hanging in the hall and which the suitors might otherwise be able to use. You've got to remove them and conceal them. And what you should do is to leave just 2 swords, 2 spears, 2 shields, and that will be for our use. And then if we are armed, the suitors aren't, we should be able to deal with them. I am confident of our ability to pull this off.
So the excitement mounts. We're approaching the end game now, the climax of the Odyssey. We'll start the very next morning. Tom, take us into the story.
Okay. The suitors have come back from their failed attempt to ambush Telemachus. Athena had managed to trick and fool them. And so now they've come back to Odysseus's palace, and people may be wondering, well, why don't they just kill Telemachus in Odysseus's halls? Well, the reason for that is that they don't want to risk the anger of the gods, or indeed the people of Ithaca, by publicly murdering Odysseus's son. And so that means that when Telemachus comes back from Eumaeus's hut after meeting with his father, they leave him alone. They kind of eye him warily, but they don't attack him. And so Telemachus is able to go to Penelope to talk with his mother and to tell her what he has learnt in Sparta, that Odysseus is alive. He does not tell her that Odysseus is back and that he has seen his father. So proving himself a slight chip off the old block there. He also introduces her to a guy called Theoclymenus, who is a wandering seer that he has brought back with him from Sparta. So it's the kind of thing you'd bring back from your Greek holiday. You'd pick up a wandering seer, I think, say, look what I've got. And Theoclymenus also has amazing news. And Theoclymenus says to Penelope, Odysseus, even now, back in the land of his fathers, already settled or on the move, learning of these wicked deeds, is here. And he is sowing seeds of evil for all the suitors. But Penelope doesn't believe him, thinks that this cannot be true. She's been told so many lies over the years. She just can't bring herself to believe this news. But of course, it is true, because all the while in his beggar's disguise, Odysseus is approaching the gates of his palace. And on the way, he has a run-in with his old goat herd, a guy called Melanthius. And Melanthius is very much not like Eumaeus. Melanthius feels no loyalty to Odysseus, shows no courtesy to strangers. And so when he sees this old beggar, he gives him a kick, and not realizing as he does so that, of course, he's kicking his own master. So that is something for Odysseus to bear in mind, the fact that his goat herd has kicked him. Will he wreak an awful vengeance? Well, time will tell. And now he comes up to the gates of his palace, and as he approaches them, he sees on the side of the road, lying on a dung heap, riddled with flies, an old scabby dog. And this dog is Argos, his beloved hunting dog, the dog that he had raised by hand as a puppy before he left for Troy. And as he walks past in his disguise as a beggar, nobody else recognizing him, Argos does recognize him, raises his head, pricks up his ears, wags his tail, and then, quote Homer, his fate, Black Death, took him in its grip. The moment he saw Odysseus, after 20 years had passed. So the single most tragic moment in the Greek history of relationships between pet owners and their pets. Very sad moment indeed, very famous.
Yeah. So now, in his beggar's garb, Odysseus, after 20 years away, goes into his palace. And Melanthius, the goat herd, mad from Melanthius now, and who's got teamed up with his sister Melantho, who is a concubine of one of the suitors, They mock him, don't they? Because they just think he's a beggar. He's just a tramp or whatever.
Yeah, they've got no time for him. And also they've got no time for Penelope either. Neither of them loyal to Penelope in the slightest.
Yeah.
Odysseus, disguised as a beggar, is led into the hall, and one of the suitors, a guy called Antinous, Robert Pattinson, I think, in the Christopher Nolan film, he throws a footstool at Odysseus. And to be fair to the other suitors, they do think that this is poor behaviour. They think, you really shouldn't just throw stools at beggars. That will bring bad luck. The gods will be angry. And so they make sure to give the old beggar some bread and meat and to kind of welcome him. And so the beggar is kind of sat at the side of the hall, the disguised Odysseus, and Penelope comes down and she notices him and she thinks, he has the look of someone who might have wandered in far lands. Maybe he has news of my husband. And so that evening she summons him for a private conversation. She doesn't recognize him, but there's something about him that makes Penelope kind of confess to him all her grief, all her longing for her husband, and all her dread that she simply won't be able to keep these suitors at bay for much longer. And the disguised Odysseus replies to this by saying, well, I have news of your missing husband. I've seen him. And he gives a description of Odysseus that is so convincing that Penelope is persuaded that he's telling the truth. And she starts weeping, the thought that perhaps Odysseus, her husband, really is out there. And the beggar says, you are right to have hope. Trust me, Odysseus is on his way. And Penelope is so happy about this that she says, look, you're covered in scabs and dirt. Let's have you washed. And so she summons an elderly attendant in the palace, Eurycleia, who had once been the nurse of Odysseus, so knew Odysseus very well and intimately. Penelope orders Eurycleia to wash the feet of this old beggar. And Eurycleia does so, and she sees that there is a scar on the thigh of this beggar. And she recognizes it because this was a scar that Odysseus had got as a young man when he'd been out hunting boar with his grandfather. And Eurycleia, because she had often washed Odysseus, of course, she now recognizes it. And she says to him, truly, you are Odysseus, dear child. And Odysseus said, be silent, do not reveal who I am, puts his hand over her mouth, almost throttles her with his desperation not to have his secret betrayed. And so Eurycleia keeps the secret. And he then goes back to his conversation with Penelope, and Penelope says, look, I've got a plan, best way that I can think of to keep the suitors at bay. What I'm going to do the next day, I am going to go down to them, and Odysseus, my missing husband, he has this great bow, which only he had ever been able to string. And I'm going to tell the suitors, whichever of you can string the bow and then shoot an arrow through 12 double-headed axes lined up in a row in the hall. This was a favourite party trick of Odysseus's. If one of you can do that, then you will become my husband. And Odysseus hears this plan and he says, yeah, that is brilliant. That is a tremendous plan. Because, of course, it completely dovetails with what he wants to do. And I think there is an ambiguity in Homer. There is the possibility that maybe Penelope has recognized him.
Yeah.
But she is a woman of tricks like he is. They're kind of starting to play this game where they're each telling tall stories to the other, not quite revealing. I mean, it's not absolutely stated, but I think part of the fascination of the scene is that that is clearly a possibility. The two of them now retire to bed. So Penelope, we're told, cried for her dear husband Odysseus until sweet sleep was poured onto her eyelids by Athena of the bright owl eyes. Meanwhile, Odysseus has gone down. He's lying in the hall and he can hear various slave girls in the household slipping out to have sex with the suitors who've taken them as concubines. And he's furious about this. He's anxious about how he's going to deal with the suitors. You know, is he taking on too much? And so he can't sleep. But then Athena appears to him, reassures him, and as she had granted Penelope the gift of sleep, so Athena grants Odysseus the gift of sleep. And both husband and wife get the rest that they're going to need for what is going to be a very, very momentous day.
All right. So the fateful day has dawned at last. This is the day when there's going to be this contest with the bow and the axe for the hand of Penelope. The suitors are in great form. They're feasting, they're fighting with each other, they're throwing bones at the beggar, who is, of course, Odysseus.
Yeah.
But Odysseus and Telemachus are getting ready for what they know will be a decisive moment. So Telemachus has taken the weapons out of the hall, hasn't he? And they have Eumaeus on hand, who's the one guy that they can trust. There's also another cowherd, I think. Is that right?
Yeah. So Eumaeus is the pig herd, the swine herd, and this guy is the cowherd Philoetius. He's also loyal. Mm-hmm. And so Odysseus hasn't yet revealed who he is to either of these guys, but he knows that he can trust them, so they're on hand. And then we've got the wandering seer, who Telemachus had brought back from his holiday to Sparta with him. And he pops up, and the suitors are all having a great time, and then he tells them what's coming. Blood is spattered all over the walls and the beautiful rafters. The entry is filled with ghosts, the courtyard filled with them too, which isn't at all the kind of thing that you want if you're having a great time. So the hour arrives. Penelope enters the hall, and she is holding the great bow and quiver of Odysseus, and behind her a train of her women holding the 12 axes made of bronze and iron. And Penelope announces to the suitors her decision that whoever can string the bow and shoot an arrow through the axe heads will become her husband. And Telemachus then sets the axes in a line along the hall, and the suitors all step forward in turn to try and string the bow, all 108 of them, and not one of them has the strength to string the bow. Meanwhile, as the suitors are doing this, Odysseus has taken Eumaeus, the loyal swineherd, and Philoetius, the loyal cowherd, outside, and at last now he reveals his true identity. And they think this is brilliant. You know, they fall to their knees, absolutely delighted, sobbing with joy. And he gives them specific tasks. Eumaeus is to bring him the bow when the time comes, and Philoetius is to lock the gates of the hall so that no one can escape or summon help. Inside the hall, the suitors have all been trying to string this massive bow and failing. And so Odysseus goes back inside the hall and he makes a suggestion. He says, well, why don't we have a go tomorrow? At dawn, the god will grant victory to whomsoever he wishes. And in the meanwhile, he says, while we're waiting, because you're all obviously now at a bit of a loose end, why don't I have a try? You'll find it entertaining watching me, a stooped old beggar, having a go. Where's the harm? And at this, the suitors explode in indignation. And Antinous, who, you know, the guy who'd chucked the stool at him right at the beginning, so the most boorish of all the suitors, he rounds on Odysseus disguised as the beggar with insults. But first Penelope and then Telemachus tell Antinous, show some manners. You are in our hall. And Telemachus tells Penelope, go to your rooms. So again, you know, he's definitely manned up, I think it's fair to say. And then he gives a secret nod to Eumaeus. This is the signal to, you know, we're about to go. And so Eumaeus, as he'd been instructed to do, goes over, picks up the bow and gives it to Odysseus. And Odysseus tests the bow. He scans it. Homer says that he almost caresses it. And then abruptly, to the absolute stupefaction of the watching suitors, he strings it. And he plucks the string to test its pitch. And as he does so, we're told, Zeus sends a flash of lightning from the clear blue sky overhead. And then Odysseus takes an arrow and he knocks it and he draws and he lets fly. And the arrow passes through all 12 of the axe heads. Yes, the bronze-weighted shaft sailed straight through them. And at this point, Telemachus reaches for his sword and spear, and Odysseus strips off his rags, and he aims an arrow at Antinous, the worst behaved of all the suitors, and he lets fly. And Antinous, who is obliviously lifting a great golden goblet to his lips as all this is happening, is struck directly in the throat, and blood spurts out in a great jet. It's a very cinematic description from Homer. And at the spectacle of this, there's complete pandemonium. And the suitors all think that the beggar must have done it by accident. I mean, surely this is the only explanation. But no, because now comes the moment when Odysseus announces himself to the hall. You dogs, you never imagined that I would make my way home from the country of the Trojans. Look how you've wasted my house, how you forced yourselves upon the slave women in bed, how while I was still alive, but out of sight, you courted my wife. And the slaughter begins, and it is terrible, and it is total.
But there is a chance for the suitors, isn't there? Because you'd mentioned earlier this goat herd, Melanthius, who had identified himself as an absolute villain by kicking Odysseus when he was on his way in. And this bloke actually slips out of the hall and starts to bring them weapons and armour, doesn't he?
He does. But fortunately for Odysseus, he's rumbled by Eumaeus and Philotius. And they truss him up and they lift him up to the roof beams and they leave him hanging there. And this portends nothing good for Melanthius. And meanwhile, the slaughter is continuing in the hall, and Athena has turned up for the fun. And she's not there to help Odysseus, but basically to goad him on and tell him to kill even faster. And she materializes first as Mentor, so this old friend of Odysseus's, which was the form that she'd appeared to Telemachus at the beginning of this episode. And then she turns into a swallow and she perches on the great smoke-blackened roof beam of the hall. And this is something that she loves doing. She loves taking on the form of a bird, and particularly when there are spectacles of bloodshed. So in the Iliad, she had disguised herself as a vulture, and there are descriptions of her kind of shivering with delight at the spectacle of blood being spilled. And spectacles of blood being spilled is absolutely what she gets now in the hall of Odysseus. So tremendous violence, tremendous slaughter. All the suitors end up dead. And the metaphor that Homer uses is that of fish being dragged onto a beach in nets and speared. And there's an echo there of what had happened to Odysseus's men in the harbour of the Laestrygonians, where the Laestrygonians had gone and speared all his men. So the suitors are wiped out. But they are not the only victims of Odysseus's terrible vengeance, because when the slaughter is done, he demands to know of Eurycleia, his old nurse, which of the servant girls have been sleeping with the suitors. And Eurycleia replies, well, there were 12 of them. So it's a bit like post-Vichy France. You know, they are female collaborators, horizontal.
That's exactly the analogy I thought of. And their fate is horrible, isn't it?
Yes, so they are told to carry out the corpses of the suitors, among them their dead lovers, and then to clean the hall, the tables, the benches. Meanwhile, Telemachus has strung a ship's cable from a pillar to a beam, and from this cable, the maids are hanged. And to quote Homer, horrible description, just as when some thrushes with slender wings or some doves go crashing into a snare, and we're told that as they are throttled, the girls' feet twitch. And then Homer says, but not for very long.
I wonder if Tom Holland's going to be doing this in the film, because he's Telemachus, isn't he?
I mean, it's genuinely interesting to see whether the slaughter of the servant girls is included. Can't imagine Matt Damon doing it, but who knows? It'll always be interesting to see whether Melanthius features as a character in the Nolan film, because he is given a particularly horrible punishment. So his nose and ears are sliced off, his genitals are cut off and fed to dogs, and his hands and feet are amputated. And Homer does not specify whether he dies of these mutilations or whether he's just left to eke out a hideous living as a beggar.
Yeah. What would one prefer? I don't know.
There is a lot of brutality in this world. But Eurycleia, I mean, she thinks it's all brilliant. She couldn't be happier at the spectacle of all this slaughter and bloodshed and castration. And in fact, she's almost laughing for joy as she rushes up to tell her mistress, Penelope, what has been going on. But Penelope still can't quite believe it. Or does she? Is she still playing games? And she comes downstairs and she gazes at Odysseus. And Homer says that she is torn by uncertainty. Sometimes as she stared at him, she seemed to see his face, but sometimes she failed to recognize him dressed in vile rags. And Telemachus can't believe this. How can his mother possibly doubt that she is gazing at her husband, Telemachus's father? But Penelope says, look, if he truly is Odysseus, we will know each other in our own ways. For we have signs We have secrets that are known only to the two of us. And Odysseus smiles at this. And again, I think there's this sense that they're playing the kind of games that perhaps they played before he left for Troy. And so he says, run me a bath. And Penelope obeys, and a bath is run for him. And then when he steps out from the bath, we're told that Athena poured great beauty upon his head. But Penelope, she's still not welcoming him back as her husband. And Odysseus says, your heart is made of iron. You are the hardest of women. But Penelope says, I don't care. I'm not going to be taken for a fool. And she says to Eurycleia, go and move the bed out of our bridal chamber, the chamber that Odysseus, my husband, built with his own hands. And when Odysseus hears this, he explodes. And he says, what do you mean? This bed can't be moved, because when I made it myself, I fashioned one of the four boasts out of a living olive tree. And I had then built the bedchamber around this living olive tree, around this bed that I've made out of it, adorning it with inlays of gold and silver and ivory. So in other words, the only way that the bed could be moved is if someone had cut the living trunk of the tree. And this is something known only to Odysseus, only to Penelope. And so when he says this, at last, Penelope's knees give way and her heart as well. And she embraces him and she kisses him, and she is struck in her joy by the last of the poem's great similes. And it reverses what had happened, because now it is Penelope who is being compared to the sailor lost at sea. She, Homer says, is like a shipwrecked sailor crusted in brine, who at last treads on dry land after escaping from disaster.
Nice.
And the great moment of husband and wife being joined together after all these adventures, all these many, many years of absence, at last it arrives, and they retire to bed, and Athena holds back the coming of the dawn so that they can enjoy the ultimate reunion. And the amazing thing is, again, it's another kind of postmodern kind of meta aspect of the poem, that they have time, because Athena has pushed the dawn back, for the pair of them to catch up on what the other has been doing. And so Odysseus basically tells the story of his adventures. So essentially what we covered in episode 1. And Penelope tells Odysseus what she's been up to. So basically the outline of this episode. So in other words, the first people to narrate the action, the story of the Odyssey, are Odysseus and Penelope themselves.
And the first people to hear it.
And the first people to hear it, although obviously not the last.
So the appeal of the Odyssey, Tom, what do you think it boils down to? Because it's obviously the product of a very specific time and place, and yet it's proved so enduring and so influential on Western literary culture more generally.
I think it's exactly that fusion. I think it's the fact that it has gods, it features famous monsters. Speaking for myself, I loved that as a child. That was the quality that I loved. But also, to be honest, I loved the violence of it and the murderous quality of Odysseus, as well as the cunning aspect of him.
Yeah.
People, I think, enjoy that in stories.
There's a savagery to it that's often lost in children's versions, I think. A cruelty.
But also, I think the basic plot of it is so adaptable. It can be retold in so many ways, and it has been retold in lots of ways. I mean, there are elements of it in Virgil's poem, the Aeneid. That in turn influences Dante, who describes Odysseus after he has returned to Ithaca. He ends up bored and he sets sail for his last great voyage to the ends of the world. And that is then reworked by Tennyson in the 19th century in his great poem Ulysses. And I think it's a perfect way to end this, because it describes a hero who will never come to rest, who will always be embarking on fresh adventures. And you can see that now with the Christopher Nolan film. There was the Ralph Fiennes film as well, which describes his homecoming. And that is just one of a kind of endless number of reworkings that continue to be made in film, in fiction, in poetry. So let's end it with Tennyson's Ulysses, Odysseus saying how he is going to leave on one last final voyage. Though much is taken, much abides, and though we are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven, that which we are, one equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield.
Well, thank you, Tennyson. And thank you, Tom, for what's been an epic journey, an odyssey, dare I say.
Literally so.
Through this most influential of all great stories. So next week, we will be somewhere very different. We'll be in late 1880s, fin de siècle, Vienna, for the murder-suicide mystery of Meyerling. And Rest is History Club members can get both of those episodes on Monday. You won't have to wait. And by the way, we are running our summer sale. So if you want to join the Rest is History Club, this is the moment. For a limited time only, you can get 20% off an annual membership using the code SUMMER26. And that offer is valid until August the 31st. So on that bombshell, thank you very much, Tom. Thank you, everybody, and goodbye.
Goodbye.